Good afternoon. How's everybody doing today? You guys ate all the pie already, though. All right. So it's good to be back here in Norfolk. Today, we're going to be talking about a topic we probably don't think about too often, except for during this time of the year. We're going to be looking at food in colonial America. Now, why would we think about that this time of year? Something coming up next week? Yeah, Thanksgiving. Usually, we all gather around with our friends and family on the fourth Thursday in November and celebrate a day of Thanksgiving. We sit down, we eat a lot, we watch some football, we fall asleep while watching football, that sort of thing. And it's an American tradition. And it's a tradition that has roots back to the very earliest establishment of English presence in North America, the English colonists here in this part of the country. So we're going to explore today a little bit about what else were those people eating? What were the Pilgrims eating? What were the early colonists eating? What was life like in colonial America? How did people survive? So we'll start with a question. How many of you like to eat? All right. It's a good question. So everybody's at least partially interested so far. So we are going to take a look at what our earliest forebears ate here in North America, here in New England. Now today, if you go out to eat, you have pretty much limitless variety. You can eat all sorts of different stuff. You could go for seafood, you could go for steak, you could go for Indian or Thai or Chinese or Italian or whatever, right? The Pilgrims didn't have those options. They were very limited in what they could eat. It was basically what they could bring with them or what they could grow. So that's going to be one of the main factors that shapes the foodways, the eating habits of early European Americans. Now, before we jump right into the Pilgrims, however, we do need to consider the fact that when the Pilgrims show up in Plymouth in 1620, they weren't alone here. There were other people who already lived here, the Native Americans, the Wampanoags, and the various other tribes of New England. These are people that had lived in this region for centuries, for millennia, and they had developed their own foodways, their own means of growing food, harvesting food, catching food, and serving that food. So before we delve into the Pilgrims, we should look at what the Native Americans ate. Now, the name of this talk is Stew Pie and Rum Punch. I tried to get them to serve rum. They wouldn't let me do that, but I know you came too late. But stew pie was actually a dish that was served in colonial times, and I'll give you the recipe for that at the end of the talk if you're interested. It's a pretty straightforward recipe. Rum punch, a delightful beverage, which we'll talk about later on. But we're going to be looking at these early American foodways, these early American eating customs, and we start off, of course, with the Native Americans. Now, the images you see on the screen were drawn by an English artist, an English explorer who had come to North America in the late 16th century, a man by the name of John White. In 1585, comes from England and goes to the area around the Chesapeake Bay, around modern-day Virginia. He was part of an expedition sent by the English to find a suitable place to establish an English colony. They were looking for a place to plant the English flag in North America. So John White comes over and he's exploring around the Chesapeake Bay and he's interacting with the native populations that live in that region. And he keeps a journal of the people he runs into, and he creates these drawings, which are later published in Europe and sell across England. And they show various means of eating and drinking among the Native Americans. We can see here, what's going on in this scene? Can anybody make that out? They're fishing. They're fishing in a dugout canoe. They're using spears. They're using nets. They have a fish weir set up across a body of water so the fish get trapped in there. You just pull the fish out. Here we see, as it's called, an Indian man and woman eating from a communal plate. And then over there, we see John White's interpretation of a Native American woodland period village with religious ceremony going on over here, food being laid out there, and fields for growing their crops. So this was typical of East Coast North American Native Americans at this time. A lot of people lived in this manner, subsistence farming supplemented with hunting and fishing. Though these images were created in Virginia, it was the same type of lifestyle here in New England. The people that lived in this region survived through the same means. Growing corn, growing squash, growing beans, hunting and fishing. Those were the main food products that the Native Americans relied on. Now, when those pilgrims first show up in 1620, they are coming from an entirely different world. They are coming from an English environment, and they bring with them their English food habits. Now, what was English food like in the early 17th century? Anybody want to travel back in time and try something?
The same as it is now.
Kind of the same as it is now. Boiled meats, basically. It probably was not the most flavorful and certainly not the healthiest cuisine, but it was a cuisine that the early pilgrims, the early English settlers of North America were familiar with. It's one that they brought with them. The ideas of that cuisine they brought with them to North America. Now, who gets credit for discovering America? Christopher Columbus. Of course, Christopher Columbus didn't really discover anything. He got lost. He thought he was someplace else when he lands in the islands of the Caribbean. But Christopher Columbus will play an important role in changing the lifestyles of people on both sides of the Atlantic Ocean. Obviously, we know Christopher Columbus comes across the Atlantic Ocean in 1492, runs into the islands of the Caribbean, and essentially helps the Spanish establish a Spanish empire in the Caribbean and Central and South America. In the wake of Christopher Columbus, other Europeans begin coming across the Atlantic Ocean, establishing their own colonies. You have the Portuguese in Brazil. Eventually, you have the Dutch in what is today New York, and the French up in what is today Quebec and Montreal. And the English are kind of late in the game. They eventually make their way to North America. In 1607, the first successful English colony is established at Jamestown, Virginia. And by 1620, we have pilgrims landing in Plymouth. In 1630, the Puritans, John Winthrop and his followers, have established Boston. So you have this cross-oceanic connection. People from one part of the world moving to another part of the world. Now, what Columbus establishes in his transatlantic voyage is sometimes referred to as the Columbian Exchange. It wasn't just the movement of people across the globe, across the Atlantic Ocean, that begins in 1492. It was the movement of biological entities, plants, animals, and diseases that begin to be disseminated. A bunch of things coming from the old world, Europe, Asia, and Africa, brought to the New World, and from the New World, brought back to the old world. So we see this exchange of biological entities. Now, this ties into our story of food, because if we look at some of the commodities that were exchanged, often accidentally across the Atlantic Ocean, you have, coming from the Americas, going back to Europe and Africa, things like beans, cacao, maize or corn, peanuts, pineapples, potatoes, pumpkins, squash, sweet potatoes, tobacco, not really edible, but still. Down here you have tomatoes. I'll come back to tomatoes in a second. And down at the bottom you have turkeys. Anybody drive around and see lots of turkeys? Yeah. The turkeys are Native American birds. They are from here. They were not brought here from someplace else. Coming the other way, westward across the Atlantic Ocean, you had products like bananas, cattle, chickens, citrus fruit, coffee beans. Coffee, very important. Where does coffee come from originally? Ethiopia. It was a wild plant that grew in the highlands of Ethiopia, eventually cultivated by the Ethiopians. Eventually, a monopoly on coffee production is held by Arab merchants. And after that, eventually, Europeans steal coffee from the Arabs and bring it and transplant it to the Americas. So coffee, grapes, horses, onions, peaches, pigs, rice, sugar cane, and wheat. All of those are coming from the old world to the new world. What we see during this period of the Columbian Exchange is a growing diversity of food products. Now, things on this side of the Atlantic Ocean are being shared with that side of the Atlantic Ocean, which means that there are a lot more food products available. There are a lot more things that are available for people to eat. Now, I mentioned tomatoes. How many of you like Italian food? What would Italian food be like without tomatoes? It'd be it'd still be good, but it wouldn't be as good, right? It's said that spaghetti is introduced to Italy by Marco Polo. This might be fictional, but by Marco Polo in the 13th century. Tomatoes don't make it to Italy until the 16th century. So for 300 years, Italians were eating plain spaghetti noodles, which is why this is very important for me personally. In any case, you have this exchange of food products back and forth across the Atlantic Ocean, this exchange of biological entities. Now, the thing that's not shown there are diseases. Europeans bring numerous diseases from the Old World to the New World, things like yellow fever, things like smallpox, and those will have a horrific impact on the native populations in the Americas. It's estimated that within 50 years of Christopher Columbus contacting the Americas, something like 90% of the Native American population dies because of European Old World diseases. Now, there were some diseases that came from the Americas back to the Old World. Diseases like syphilis, for example. What kind of a disease is syphilis? If you have to think back to your high school health class, that's fine. There was a gift from the Native Americans back to European populations. And what do we see in the 16th century? But tremendous outbreaks of syphilis across Europe. So we kind of know what people were doing with their spare time, I guess, during that time period. In any case, the establishment of the Columbian Exchange will have a profound impact on food, will have a profound impact on how populations on both sides of the ocean survive. Now, in the early 17th century, we begin to see numerous Englishmen leaving England and making their way to colonial outposts on the east coast of North America. At this time, England was essentially a backwater country. It was out there on the northwestern fringes of Europe. It was torn by internal turmoil, religious strife, factions fighting against one another. It really wasn't a major player in global European politics yet, but it does begin to undertake this effort to establish colonies across the Atlantic Ocean. And many of those colonists who were coming to the New World were religious separatists who were not part of the main religious establishment, the Anglican Church in England. They were Puritans. They were a little bit more radical than the main English Protestants. And they felt uncomfortable in England. They left England to find a place where they could practice their religion freely. Now, we often tell our school kids that the Puritans came across the Atlantic Ocean looking for religious freedom. It's just kind of a half-truth. They were looking for religious freedom for themselves, not for anybody else. They wanted to come and be left alone. They didn't necessarily want Catholics and Quakers and other groups living amongst them. But they do come across the Atlantic Ocean in the 17th century in this movement that's called the Puritan Migration. And we can see tens of thousands of Puritans leave England. Most of them end up in the northeast part of what is eventually the United States. Some go to the islands of the Caribbean. Not a bad place to end up, I guess. But you do have this mass migration of Englishmen, English Puritans coming to North America, settling in places like Massachusetts, Rhode Island, Connecticut, some in New York, some down in Virginia. But you do have this movement of people. And again, they were bringing with them their food traditions, their food beliefs, the food products that they were familiar with in England, and bringing them to a new world. When the first English Puritans show up here, they're completely out of their element. They don't know how to survive. Famously, in 1620, some of these religious separatists, a group that we today call the Pilgrims, who were the most radical of the English Puritans, decide to leave England to find religious haven, to find a place where they could practice their religion freely. And in 1620, a bunch of them get on a boat and sail across the Atlantic Ocean. What's the name of that boat? Mayflower. The Mayflower. Anybody seen the replica of the Mayflower that's down in Plymouth today? Impressed by the size of the boat? It's tiny. It's about the size of this room, about the length of this room, maybe. It is not a big vessel. And yet, here you have these religious refugees, for lack of a better term, giving up everything, loading up onto this ship, 102 passengers, about 30 crew members, and all of their livestock, dogs, sheep, goats, and poultry, on this tiny little boat, a rickety-looking vessel, and setting sail in the North Atlantic, hoping to make it across the Atlantic to North America to establish a place where they could practice their religion freely. The Atlantic Ocean is big, and the Mayflower is very, very small, and it was very, very crowded. The journey from England to North America was a treacherous journey. The ship was buffeted by high seas. There was rampant seasickness among the passengers. And all of the passengers were essentially confined below decks. They weren't allowed to go up to the main deck because then they would be in the way of the sailors. So it must have been a really awful voyage going across the Atlantic Ocean. Yet these pilgrims do persevere. They do make it all the way across the Atlantic Ocean, and they arrive here in North America. And they get here. And where do they first land? Provincetown. They land in Provincetown, and they get out of the boat. They look at the sand dunes. They say, this is nice, but it looks like it's going to be a little bit crowded in the summertime, and it's a little bit too artsy for my taste. So they get back on their boat, and they sail across the harbor and end up eventually in Plymouth. And there they begin setting up a little colony, a little town that we today call Plymouth Plantation. Now, that first winter for the Pilgrims was awful. About half of the passengers that were carried on the Mayflower die that first winter. They die from disease, they die from malnutrition. The only food that these people had was the stuff they brought with them. And that's not going to last you very long over a winter in New England. So by the time we get to the spring of 1621, things don't look good for the Pilgrims. They are thousands of miles away from home in a foreign land where they have no idea how to survive, and half of their number is gone. Well, what happens in the spring of 1621? The Pilgrims are saved. And how are they saved? Well, one day the Pilgrims are there trying to make a living, trying to get by, when into the middle of their settlement walks a Native American man. And he addresses them in English. A man by the name of Samoset shows up among the Pilgrims, and he says, "Hi, Englishmen." Now imagine the surprise that the Pilgrims must have felt that this complete stranger from someplace you had never been comes and speaks your language. Well, how did Samoset know even a little bit of English? Well, he had interacted with English sailors that had been sailing along the coast of New England for decades at that point. English fishermen who had sometimes landed to dry their catch. He had learned a little bit of English that way. But he wasn't a really good English speaker. So he says, you know what, wait here. There's somebody up the road who speaks much better English than I do. So Samoset disappears, and he comes back with another guy whose name is Tisquantum. We know him today as Squanto. Squanto happened to speak very good English. Now, how did Squanto speak English? How did he learn English? Well, you know those English sailors that had been along the coast of New England? They had actually kidnapped Squanto and brought him back to England. So he had lived in England for several years, had learned the language, and then came back to his native land with some other sailors. So here you had Squanto, who spoke English. And Squanto comes along and essentially becomes the translator for the Pilgrims. He establishes social ties, ties of alliance between the Pilgrims in Plymouth and the local Native American tribe, the Wampanoags. And the Wampanoag leader, a man by the name of Massasoit. And it is through the agency of Squanto and the Wampanoags that the Pilgrims are taught how to survive in New England, how to farm, what to plant, how to plant their crops, how to fertilize their crops. There's the famous story that Squanto told the Pilgrims that when they were planting corn, to put a fish in the bottom of the hole where they were planting their corn seeds, and the fish would decay and fertilize the stalk, and you'd have better corn. So it is through the help of Squanto and the Wampanoags that the Pilgrims don't die off in 1621, that they do manage to survive. And in fact, they not only survive, but they prosper. And in the fall of 1621, the Pilgrims have a lush harvest. They have enough food to allow them to survive the coming winter. So what do they decide to do to celebrate the harvest and the plenty that has been provided for them? They decide to celebrate. They decide to have a day of thanksgiving, a day of giving thanks to God, who they credited with their survival. So in 1621, the Pilgrims celebrate what comes to be called the first Thanksgiving. So they all gathered around the table and talked politics and got angry at each other and ate a turkey, right? Probably not. The first Thanksgiving was very different than how we celebrate the day today. It was very different than how it was portrayed in paintings throughout our schooling. The first Thanksgiving was actually kind of a complex event. It wasn't a one-day thing. It lasted for several days. And we have this kind of idealistic image of the Pilgrims sitting down with the Wampanoags and sharing their meal. That's kind of, sort of not really accurate, because the Wampanoags weren't really invited to the first Thanksgiving. They just kind of showed up. They did bring food, so that was okay, but they did just show up. Now, we have two historical accounts of the first Thanksgiving, two people who were there who actually wrote down what happened. One, the most colorful one, was by Edward Winslow. Edward Winslow was one of the leaders of the Plymouth colony, one of the leading pilgrims. And he, in his diary, left us an account of what happened on that first Thanksgiving. He says, "Our harvest being gotten in, our governor sent forth men on fowling, that so we might have, after a special manner, rejoice together, after we had gathered the fruits of our labors. They four in one day killed as much fowl as with a little help beside, served the company almost a week." So they went hunting and were tremendously successful in hunting, had enough food to last them a week. "Many of the Indians coming amongst us, and amongst the rest their greatest king, Massasoit, with some 90 men, whom for 3 days we entertained and feasted. And they went out and killed 5 deer, which they brought to the plantation and bestowed on our governor and upon the captain and others." So the Pilgrims are having a party. They're out hunting. They're gathering up game, local game, some fowl, probably some duck, maybe some sparrow, that sort. I don't know if you eat sparrow, but some birds. They're successful in their hunting. They want to celebrate their successful harvest. They're starting to have a party. And Massasoit and his guys show up. And they're invited to the party. So for 3 days, the Pilgrims and the Native Americans feasted together. The natives went out and caught some deer, bring the deer to the party. Now, what is noticeably absent from this description of the first Thanksgiving? I was going to say pumpkin pie, but sure, turkey. Turkey. It doesn't specifically say turkey. Now, it could be that turkey was part of that fowl that was hunted, but there might not have been turkey at the first Thanksgiving. We, of course, today love our turkey on Thanksgiving. But this is really the origins of the feast that we are going to celebrate next week. It's the feast, the origins of the idea of American exceptionalism, really. The idea that we are special and that we are thanking God for our specialness and our survival. The first Thanksgiving right here. Now, for the most part, the Pilgrims do adopt the farming techniques and the subsistence techniques of the Native Americans. They're in a new land. They have to learn to survive on new things. Hunting plays an important role in their diet. Fishing plays an important role in their diet. But in terms of farming, what was it that the Pilgrims planted? Well, it was the same stuff the Native Americans had planted. Sometimes referred to as the Three Sisters. You had corn, maize, you had beans, and you had squash, all variety of squash. So these products, particularly the corn and the beans, become the staple food products of the New England colonists. This was what the Native Americans survived on. This is what the early English settlers survive on. These will become the crops that are easy to plant, easy to tend, easy to harvest, and that would become the basis of many different types of cuisine in New England. This is actually what corn originally looked like. The corn that we get today at the grocery store, that's kind of that pale yellow, is really heavily hybridized and genetically modified. It's not what corn was when the Pilgrims were here. And of course, they planted a whole variety of beans. Well, what do you do with corn and beans? Why would those be so important in terms of crops? Well, there's lots of protein, there's lots of starch, so they're very calorie dense. And you can store it. You dry it and you store it, and it will keep you through the winter. But what are you going to do if you have a handful of dried corn kernels? You're just going to eat that? You're going to grind it. You're going to turn it into cornmeal, essentially into a corn flour. Cornmeal was something that the Native American populations relied on because they would grow the corn, they would harvest it, they would dry it, and then they would grind it into a powder. And that powder was very long-lasting and very transportable. Many Native American hunters and braves would, when they were traveling for long distances through the woods, would bring with them a leather pouch full of cornmeal. And then whenever they got hungry, they would take that cornmeal, mix it with some water, and turn it into kind of like a polenta type stuff, an uncooked polenta, and eat handfuls of that. Yeah, it's probably not the tastiest thing, but it sustained them. It gave them nourishment. It allowed them to continue hunting or exploring or traveling or whatever they were doing. So the Pilgrims and the early English settlers, because by the 1630s there are a lot more Englishmen in New England, relied on corn as a subsistence crop, relied on corn for their survival. The thing is, the English didn't necessarily want to eat handfuls of soggy cornmeal. So what are we going to do with this cornmeal? How else could we make it sort of palatable? You could cook it. And you could cook it into some sort of a bread-like material. One of the cornmeal products that becomes very popular and very widespread in New England comes to be called Johnny cakes. What is a Johnny cake? That's cornmeal mush, essentially fried in bacon fat or lard or butter or something like that. It is like a cornmeal cake. It is like a cornbread almost. The bacon fat probably makes it really tasty. But these become a staple food product for many early New Englanders because you could cook it up very quickly, very easily, very economically. Anybody had Johnny cakes? Sort of, yeah. They don't necessarily look like this. These kind of actually look like English muffins almost. But it was essentially a cornbread type product that you could make in a hurry. You could throw it into your cast iron frying pan, throw it over the open fire, and within minutes you would have a product that you could eat. You could top that with butter, such as you see over here, and it was a quick meal, a quick snack. Now, plants were just part of the diet of early New Englanders. What else did they eat? Well, what's another product that New England is famous for? Lobsters, seafood, fish. And in particular, what type of seafood? Well, you got that, right? The cod. We have a piece of land here in Massachusetts that kind of sticks out into the Atlantic Ocean that's called Cape Cod. What's it named after? But the codfish. The cod was actually a tremendously important commodity. It was a tremendously important food product. It had been for centuries. There were Portuguese fishermen in the 15th century who were sailing the North Atlantic, basically looking for cod, chasing cod. Cod can be pretty large. You can get a lot of weight ratio, weight to bone ratio on a cod. And cod can be made very long lasting. What can you do with cod to preserve it? You dry it and salt it. You dry it and salt it, it becomes like a piece of wood and it lasts practically forever. So cod becomes an important commodity. The Native Americans relied on fishing, they relied on cod, they relied on various shellfish, oysters, clams, and even lobster. Lobster was once considered the food of the poor. It was a product that fishermen would catch in their nets and not know what to do with, so they would give it to the orphanages and stuff like that. Today, how much does lobster cost per pound today?
Too much.
Too much. Does anybody really like lobster?
Yes.
I'm kind of ambivalent. I find it a lot of work for what you get out of it. But anyway, seafood does become an important commodity, an important food product for early New England settlers. The Native Americans relied on it. The early English settlers rely on it. Fish of different varieties. Now, how important was this as a food product, particularly the shellfish, particularly clams and oysters? How much did people eat? Well, this picture kind of gives us an idea. That is called a shell midden in archaeological terms. A midden is a garbage pile. And that is a midden made out of oyster shells. A pile of used oyster shells, probably 10 feet deep. And it looks like it stretches a long way. Oysters, clams were an important food product. An oyster doesn't run away from you that quickly. You can collect a lot of those in a relatively short time, and they can be cooked in a variety of ways, consumed in a variety of ways. They do become a very important part of the diet of the Native Americans and of the English once the English begin to settle here. So during the 17th century, a lot of what we see in New England is the English adapting and adopting Native American food customs. They come to rely on things like corn, like beans, like shellfish as their main means of survival. They supplement them. They bring cattle with them. They bring goats with them. They bring pigs with them. But it's mainly those agricultural products, those sea products, that are the main subsistence of many of these early New Englanders. But what happens? As the 17th century rolls on, more and more Englishmen are coming across the Atlantic Ocean and settling along the east coast of North America. More and more Englishmen are settling in New England. Lots of towns are being established. The area of English settlement moves away from the coast and begins to push toward the interior. And as the English population spreads westward across New England, new settlements are established, new farms are established. The Native American food traditions kind of become secondary as cattle and sheep and pigs start to become, once again, the prime food sources for many of these English colonists. As that's going on, the relationship between North America and England begins to evolve. Early on, the English viewed North America as kind of the faraway outpost. The religious separatists went there, and adventurous businessmen went there hoping to make a profit. But by the time we get to the end of the 17th, the beginning of the 18th century, Britain's American colonies start to become economically vital. They start to play a large role in the British economy. The raw products, the raw materials coming from North America are being brought to England and are fueling economic growth in England. What we see developing at the end of the 17th and into the 18th century is a system that is called the Atlantic economy, sometimes referred to as the triangle trade. The triangle trade was the trade back and forth across the Atlantic. It had essentially three parts: the Americas, Europe, and Africa. And each one of these parts was contributing products and people to the Atlantic economy, to the triangle trade. Now, one of the important products that starts to make its way into New England during this period was a product from the Caribbean: molasses. Molasses is starting to become more integrated into the New England economy. Now, what do you use molasses for?
Rum.
Eventually, we make rum. You could pour molasses on a Johnny cake, right, and maybe sweeten that up. You could use molasses to cook your beans, baked beans, right? That sort of thing. Molasses does start to make its way into the New England economy. It would be rum, however, that becomes the main use for molasses. But as molasses and other products are coming from the Caribbean, things like whale oil and cod and lumber and furs are being sent to Britain. And Britain sends, guns and iron to Africa. And in Africa, those products are exchanged for enslaved Africans, who are then brought across the Atlantic Ocean, mainly to the Caribbean, and from the Caribbean to South America and to North America. It all becomes part of this global economy. This global economy, however, indicates growing economic stability in the British colonies. We were no longer subsistence. We were no longer struggling to survive because we had become part of this global economy, part of this global network. Wealth was growing. There were towns in New England that were becoming prosperous. Boston, for example, in 1700 is the largest British outpost in North America. Has a population of somewhere between 6,000 and 8,000 people. A fairly large settlement. So we begin to see this economic wealth, this economic growth due to this triangle trade and the establishment of the Atlantic economy. So what did that mean for the everyday person living here in New England? Well, their lifestyles were going to change, bless you. Their livelihood was going to change. Most people were still farmers, relied on the land, relied on harvesting crops and tending animals. But the way they lived develops and flourishes a little bit. Have any of you been to Plymouth, the plantation down there? What do we think about those houses that they lived in? Would you want to live in one of those? Pretty rough, pretty primitive in their structure. You basically had one room, right, with a dirt floor, unless you were lucky and you might have had some mats on the floor. By the time we get to the late 17th and early 18th century, new styles of architecture are being developed and built in New England, indicative of the growing economy and the growing wealth in the region. One of the typical architectural styles in this part of the country was the saltbox house. Saltbox houses are pretty common. You can drive around pretty much any New England town and you'll see a few of these. They are a type of house that was very practical. You had a giant fireplace in the center that was used to warm the entire house. And you generally had 2 rooms on the ground floor, 2 rooms on the second floor. Eventually, as society advances, as the houses grow bigger, you add a kitchen L to the back, and you extend the roof, giving the houses their distinctive salt box shape. That long back roof is because that back room was usually a later addition. The back room, as I said, was usually a kitchen space. It was where the cooking was done. It would eventually become the center of the house. Like most modern houses, where is most of the living done? Ironically, not in the living room. It's usually in the kitchen. When guests come over, where do they congregate? Near the kitchen. Why? Because that's where the food is. But that is where people tend to conduct a lot of their activity. And it was the same in colonial houses. The kitchens become the center place of a lot of the activity. As you see in this image over here, this is a early 18th century house. Everything's going on in the kitchen. You have the kids playing here by the open fire. That's probably not so safe. The woman cooking by the fire. The husband, he looks like a cobbler, doing work by the fire. In the background, the eldest daughter spinning, and another one churning butter. All of that was taking place in this one room. This is where much of the living occurred. You had a plain table there, and then a cupboard that had all of the family's plates on it. You wanted to show off your plates. If you had nice plates, you put them out on display. You didn't eat off of them, but you just had them out on display. It's kind of like grandma's fine china today. But it was the kitchen that becomes the center of activity. Now, as time goes on, the cooking techniques that develop do evolve. Rather than cooking everything over an open fire, there are modifications that are made to the way that colonial kitchens looked. Now, one of the important additions that we see being added to these types of kitchens are these ovens back here and one over here. Those were called beehive ovens. A beehive oven served a very specific purpose. It was used for cooking bread and for cooking pies. So you weren't doing those in a pan over the open fire anymore. You actually had an enclosed oven. It was kind of like a modern day pizza oven. You'd heat it up, it would get very, very hot, and you'd stick whatever you were cooking in there. Now, why would you cook pies? What do you do with a pie? What is a pie good for, other than dessert? You eat it, but you could also preserve it. If you cook something into a pie, you're protecting it, you're putting a layer over the filling. It'll last a little bit longer than if you just have a slab of meat laying out on the table. You have it baked into a pie. So cooking things into pies was a way of extending the shelf life of your food. Now, originally, these beehive ovens were located in the back of the hearth here, which meant that if you were putting anything in or out of it, you had to lean over the open fire, which was a dangerous proposition, particularly for the women, because the women were the ones doing most of the cooking, and the women were wearing long, flowing dresses. And there were incidences of women's dresses catching fire while they were cooking in the beehive oven. So by the 18th century, a change is made, and the beehive oven is moved to the front of the hearth, like a separate addition, a separate oven off to the side. So you'd have your main fire, and then you'd have your beehive oven off to the side. This becomes the place where the food is made. And there are various implements that are devised to allow and facilitate for cooking. Various types of spits and roasting things and pots and hooks for hanging the pots so you can move them over the fire and away from the fire. It is the kitchen that becomes the epicenter of the home. It is the kitchen where food is prepared and food is consumed and life was lived. Now, as I mentioned, the kitchen was also where you displayed your table settings, your tableware. In the 17th and 18th century, what were your plates likely to be made out of? Pewter was one of the important products. What's pewter made out of? Anybody know? It's tin. At that time, it was tin and lead, which probably isn't the best thing to eat off of. But you did have a whole wide variety of vessels for food consumption and food service. Ceramics also play a large role in what people used for eating and storing their food. What we see here are some examples of pewterware and ceramicware from the 17th and 18th century. This plate, very clearly marked 1632, comes from the early 17th century in a typical lead glazed design. The glaze that was used to decorate it was a lead-based design. There we have some pewter, also filled with lead. again, not the safest thing. This here is a stoneware jug called a Bellarmine jug, which was used for the storage of various liquids and wine and stuff like that. The Bellarmine jugs actually have an interesting story behind them. They are named after an Italian cardinal, Roberto Bellarmine. Now, why would the English, who were very much Protestant and very much not Italian, name a jug after Bellarmine? Well, one was the shape, it's kind of portly, but also they had these hideous faces on them. Now, Bellarmino, the cardinal, was one of the Catholic Church's leading advocates against the spread of Protestantism. He was one of the heads of the Inquisition, was always persecuting the Protestants. And here you have proudly Protestant England. Well, what are they going to do? They're going to craft this hideous face of one of their kind of spiritual enemies. And if you happen to be walking along and you drop your Bellarmine jug, are you going to feel bad for breaking it? Not necessarily. So it's tied to religion and religious conflict of the time period. In any case, these were very typical in many colonial homes. You would go to a home, you'd see a vessel for storing your beverages. You'd see plates similar to this or similar to this that were the objects that food was consumed off of. Now, one of the things that we might find different if we were to have a meal in the early 18th century was how food was served. If I were to come to your house for dinner and I sat down at your table, I'd probably have a plate and a fork and maybe a knife and a spoon, depending on what we were eating, right in front of me, right? In the early 18th century, that wouldn't happen. There would be a large communal dish placed in the middle of the table, a dish called a trencher, with whatever meat and sauce we were serving, and everybody would reach into that trencher and take their share out of there. The idea of individual plates doesn't really begin to emerge until the middle of the 18th century, when people begin to have their own individual place settings, when people begin to use knives and forks at the table rather than their fingers. So we see a change in how we are eating over the course of this time period. In any case, we have the establishment of these different food ways, these methods of food preparation, different types of food products, different ways we are eating the food. Most colonial kitchens in this period also had small gardens right outside the kitchen door, the colonial kitchen garden, which served a couple of purposes. One, you could grow herbs in those kitchen gardens, which were good for covering up the taste of whatever it was you were eating. Cabbage, for example. Cabbage needs all the help you can give it. But they also served a medicinal purpose. The herbs sometimes were used for to cure certain ailments. So what we see over here are a couple of examples of kitchen gardens. This is right outside of a salt box house. I believe that's in New Hampshire. Here's one down in Plymouth, right outside the kitchen door. You would grow the herbs that you needed for whatever you needed them for. And there's a list of some of the common herbs that were grown during this time period. You had things like horehound, which were used to treat chest colds. Angelica, which was used to relieve colds and soothe nerves if you happen to be shaky and nervous. It could also be used as a flavoring for puddings and desserts. Winter and summer savory had antiseptic qualities, had pain relief qualities, and could be used to flavor pork and cabbage. Again, things that could sometimes use a little bit of help. Lady's mantle was used to stop bleeding. Sage was used to aid digestion. Spearmint could be made into a tea and help to relieve nausea. And hyssop, which was made into a tea to cure things like sore throats. So all of these herbs that were grown right outside the kitchen door had multiple purposes. They could disguise the flavor of rancid meat, or they could help you get over a cold. Now, over the course of the 18th century, as English settlement spreads across New England, a communication network is established to tie the various English settlements together, to tie the towns together. What we see by the early 18th century are the emergence of the post roads. Roads and paths through the wilderness that were designed to tie various English communities together so that news and mail could be brought from point A to point B. The two main post roads came out of Boston and went to New York. One kind of cut across western Massachusetts to Springfield and then down through Hartford and then down to New York. The other went from Boston down to Providence and then along the coast out to New York. These become the main thoroughfares for getting across New England, from getting long distances over across New England. Now, the roads themselves were little more than dirt paths through the woods. They were often in bad condition. They were often dangerous because you were going through the wilderness. If you fall and sprain your ankle, you're basically stuck there until the next traveler comes along. But along the road, there was an informal system of rest areas that were set up. Every few miles along the post roads, taverns and inns were established. The taverns and inns ostensibly were places where travelers could find rest, where a person going from New York to Boston could stop for the night and find shelter and shelter for their horse and maybe get a meal. They also become informal centers of exchange. Somebody coming from Boston, heading to New York, runs into somebody in New Haven. Hey, what's happening in New York? I don't know, what's happening in Boston? And they could share a jug of ale and talk about the news of what's going on and talk about politics and the current events. So they do begin to play an important role in shaping New England society because people from different parts were mingling there, were meeting there. And they were important because people could eat and drink there. Now, today when you think of a tavern, what do you think of? You think of beer. And it's a good thing you think of beer because beer played a large role in the diets of our colonial ancestors. Many taverns become famous for certain meals, for certain dishes or certain drinks. What you see over here is a bill from the Oliver Cromwell Tavern in Boston. It was on School Street, basically where Old City Hall is today. And the taverns, as I said, served a variety of purposes. You could lodge there, you could get a meal there, they would take care of your horse. And if we look at this bill, you can see some of the things that were offered: board, lodging, eating, wine, punch, porter, liquor, horse keeping. So you could go to a tavern and have all of these needs taken care of if you were a merchant or if you were a traveler along the post roads. As I said, some of the taverns do become famous for their concoctions. One particularly popular drink in the 18th century was a rum-based beverage that was called flip. Has anybody heard of flip? Flip was a mix of a variety of things. Now, when we think of rum today, we think of it as kind of a sweetish, strong liqueur. Rum in colonial times would probably kill you. It had a very, very high alcohol content. You couldn't drink straight rum because it would essentially rot your gut. So the tavern owners, the innkeepers, begin to develop concoctions to make the rum palatable. One of those was flip. Flip was essentially rum mixed with some sort of creamy element, either cream, a dairy kind of cream, or egg whites or something like that. Combined with various spices, maybe nutmeg, maybe cinnamon, some sort of thing like that. And then the key to flip was that you would take a giant metal stick, right here, which was called a toddy stick, which you would have heated in your fire until it was glowing red. Then you would take the toddy stick and plunge it into the flip mixture. It would sizzle, it would sputter, it would burn, and it would impart a distinct earthy taste to the beverage itself. Essentially, the toddy stick was used to blend all the flavors together. It's what pulled the various elements of flip together. Now, flip was very popular, but there isn't really one set recipe for it. So every place made their flip their own way. The essential element was the rum and the burning stick that you stick into it to meld the flavors. And some places made better flip than other places. And some taverns along the post roads become famous for their flip, others for their punch. But it was food, drink, and lodging that were important on these taverns along the post roads. Now, almost everybody in colonial society participated in this alcoholic festivities. Almost everybody drank beer and cider. Men, women, children, the elderly, newborns, probably not newborns, but everybody was involved in drinking alcohol. The English settlers came from a very alcohol-dependent society. In England, everybody drank alcohol for one particular reason. It was safer than the water. It was safer than the water. Drinking water in London in the 16th century or in the 17th century was essentially a recipe for dysentery because there was no sewage. And what did people do with their waste products in London? You threw it out the window. And then when it rained, where did all that stuff go? Into the river. And guess what was your source of drinking water? That's not a good thing going on there. So people drank beer. They drank ciders because those were safer. The alcohol in them killed whatever was bad for you. So the early colonists bring this drinking culture with them to the Americas. When John Winthrop and his followers sail across the Atlantic Ocean aboard the Arbella in 1630 to go and establish the Massachusetts Bay Colony, to go establish Boston, the hold of the ship had hundreds of barrels of beer because it was considered such a necessity for the early English settlers. Well, beer was something that was difficult to brew. There weren't a lot of breweries in New England in the colonial times. It was a luxury that was usually brought over from England. Now, by the time of the Revolution, we do have a couple of breweries established in Boston. In fact, one particular famous individual does run a brewery, Patriot, Sam Adams. He owns one of the biggest businesses in Boston, which was a beer-making business. And eventually in the 20th century, we name a beer after him. But cider was something that was easily produced in New England. New England had abundant orchards, apples and pears, products that could be picked, crushed, and fermented and turned into beverages that will keep for a long time, beverages that won't spoil, beverages that you could drink throughout the year. So beer and cider become tremendously important parts of the New England diet, as did distilled spirits. There was, whereas beer was kind of difficult to make, it was easy to distill grains into liqueurs. So rum becomes an important part of the New England diet and the New England economy. That molasses imported from the Caribbean is distilled into rum. And there were rum distilleries all over Boston, all over New England. And whiskey also becomes very important. Now, what's whiskey made from? Pretty much any sort of grain. You can make corn whiskey, you can make wheat whiskey, you can make rye whiskey. You take the grain, you grind it up, you wet it, you add some yeast, you boil it, it distills out, and you eventually end up with whiskey. Now, what is the benefit of both rum and whiskey? Is that
Long shelf life.
long shelf life. They never spoil. If you are a farmer in, let's say, Western Massachusetts, and you grow an abundance of corn, more corn than you could possibly use, what are you going to do with it? Well, you can turn some of it into cornmeal, but the rest of it you're going to turn into a mash and you're going to turn it into a whiskey. And the whiskey will last for a long time. So these distilled spirits become an essential part of the diets of New Englanders. And they are, of course, served at the taverns. You can see these folks here having a good time with some sort of a rum punch, drinking it out of the giant punch bowl. Now, as New England grows, as more and more English settlements are established and connections are being established between the various English settlements along the East Coast, travelers were moving up and down from New York to Boston. And these travelers often lodged in the taverns where they would have meals and drink drinks. And like today, sometimes when you're on the road and you stop at a restaurant, the food's good. And sometimes when you stop on the road and you stop at a restaurant, the food's questionable. Travelers in the 18th century faced the same things that we do. Where am I going to stay? What am I going to eat when I get there? And luckily, New Englanders tended to keep a lot of diaries. They wrote everything down. There are hundreds of first-hand accounts of what it was like to live in New England during this time period. And travelers, such as Sarah Kemble Knight in 1704 and Dr. Alexander Hamilton in 1744, not the guy who the musical is named after, a different Alexander Hamilton, they kept records of what they did and what they ate and who they interacted with on their travels. So Sarah Kemble Knight tended to have not as good dining experiences as Alexander Hamilton did. We see two of the meals that she was served during her travels across New England in 1704. One night, she was served a dish of pork and cabbage. The sauce was a deep purple, which I thought was boiled in her dye kettle. What cabbage I swallowed served me for cud the whole day after. That's not a favorable review of that cuisine there. At another place, she said the innkeeper told us she had some mutton, which she would broil, which I was glad to hear. In a little time, she brought it in, but it being pickled, and my guide said it smelled strong of head sauce, we left and paid 6 pence apiece for our dinners, which was only smell. She was served a meal she couldn't even eat. So her dining experiences in New England, not so good. Alexander Hamilton, however, he was a little bit better off. One night he supped upon fried chickens and bacon, and after the supper the conversation turned upon politics, news, and the dreaded French war. So he was kind of comfortable. Some fried chicken, some bacon, and then some after-dinner conversation. At another evening, he was stopping in a tavern, and he was treated by Captain Binning of Boston with a bowl of lemon punch, probably lemon and rum, and some spices thrown in there. He gave me letters for his relations at Boston. So Hamilton was heading toward Boston, runs into a captain from Boston who says, hey, I'm going to write some letters. You can bring them to my relatives in Boston. That informal exchange network there in the taverns. So you had these various adventures of eating and drinking in New England. The food products by the 18th century had expanded. What people were eating and drinking had certainly become slightly more diverse, but was still heavily influenced by England and by Native American food products. This would have been typical kitchens in New England in the 18th century. What do we see here? Local products, apples, Johnny cakes over there, cranberries, of course, cranberries here in this part of New England, corn, and various root vegetables. All of these become staple commodities in the diets in New England over the course of the 18th century. And as I said at the beginning, the title of my talk was Stew Pie and Rum Punch. I've already kind of talked about the rum punch. You had to mix your rum with something to make it palatable. But what is a stew pie? It's kind of like a meat pie. It's kind of like a pot pie. It's something along those lines. You basically take a chunk of meat and you cook it and then you encase it in a pie crust. Here's the recipe for a stew pie. This comes from one of the earliest American cookbooks, An American Cookery from 1798, written by Amelia Simmons. A stew pie. You boil a shoulder of veal and cut up salt, pepper, and butter ½ pound and slices of raw salt pork. Make a layer of meat and a layer of biscuit or biscuit dough into a pot. Cover, close, and stew ½ an hour in 3 quarts of water only. That's the entire recipe. There's a lot of variability for what you could do with that. You basically take the meat, you chop it up, you stew it, you encase it in dough, and you steam it. And that was your stew pie. And that is something to think about as you head out into the evening. Does anybody have any questions, comments about food in colonial New England? Are we better off today than we were 200 years ago, 300 years ago? Probably. I mean, I'm sure people... What was their lifespan? It varied by, gender. It varied by profession. In general, people probably lived until their late 40s, early 50s. You do have examples of people living beyond that. John Adams lived until his 90s. So he had a very long lifespan. Obviously, if you were better off, you had a longer lifespan. But if you were in certain occupations, like you were a sailor or a stevedore, your lifespan was probably going to be much, much shorter because of the danger of your occupation. Women generally lived longer, but they faced tremendous risk in their lives. Childbirth was not a good thing. It was a tremendously dangerous undertaking for women during this time period. There's a lot of infant mortality and a lot of women dying in childbirth. So lifespans certainly weren't as long as they are now. But lifespans in New England, particularly in the 17th century, were better than lifespans in Old England. There was less disease, less crime. You lived a much healthier existence in Boston in 1680 than you did in London. So it kind of, you were better off here than you were over there. But still, it was a relatively short time.
So they drank so much alcohol.
Yes.
They just kind of always drunk.
The alcohol didn't have the beverages didn't have a super high alcohol content. So, I mean, I'm sure some people drank more than others, but the beer and the cider tended to have a relatively low alcohol content.
Even the children drank.
Even the children drank. And I guess you build up a tolerance if you're drinking from when you're 2 years old, right? But the alcohol, there was enough alcohol in the beverages to keep them safe to drink, but not enough to necessarily intoxicate. Until you get to the rum and the whiskey. That was a different case altogether. Yes?
Where might those lemons have come from that the captain had?
They would have come from trade, from places like the Caribbean, from places like the Mediterranean, part of that Atlantic economy. You can't have the lemons unless you have, that kind of long distance trade, because they're not going to grow here. So lemons, limes, citrus fruit, other oranges, those all make their way into New England. They are kind of luxury items, but they were certainly available.
How did they preserve the food?
How did they preserve the food? Well, certain foods lend themselves to preservation more than others. Root vegetables, for example, you would dig a root cellar and you would store those things underground. Things like dried beans, dried corn, you can just leave in a bag. As long as it stays dry, that'll last for a long time. But salting and smoking were major components of food preservation. Cod, again, is a good example of that. You take
After the meal, you have leftovers. You just chuck it out?
You could feed it to your livestock. You would probably just cook enough so that you didn't have leftovers. You could use it, we made let's say we cooked a brisket today, but we didn't eat the whole brisket. Well, I'm going to take what's left and wrap it in dough and stick it in the oven and turn it into a brisket bread or a meat pie of some sort. So there were methods of dealing with the leftovers. But, you can't leave the table until you finish everything in front of you anyway.
I don't think they had so much food that they didn't need to eat everything.
They, by the time we get to really the late 17th, early 18th century, New Englanders weren't starving. There was plentiful food because it was grown here. It was brought in from other colonies, particularly places like Maryland and Pennsylvania were the bread baskets of the colonies. And you did have that Atlantic trade. So there was plenty.
How were most of the vegetables prepared? I thought they would be in the meat pies, but they didn't do that.
Most of them were probably boiled. Boiling was a way of cooking pretty much everything. So you boil your turnips, boil your carrots, It was not the most exciting cuisine for most of the time.
How many times a day did they eat? Did they just eat one big meal? Did they have
That varied. That varied by profession. If you were a farmer, you would eat something quick in the morning. You'd go out in the field, maybe have a light snack in the middle of the day, and then when you came back, you'd have a big meal. If you were in the city, you would eat many times a day. Again, looking at some of those personal accounts, it seemed like some of the things that some people did was basically just eat. You'd get up, you'd go and you'd eat a morning meal that sometimes involved like pigeons and eggs and stuff like that. And you'd go about your business for a couple of hours, then you'd go eat a mid-morning meal, and you'd have like an early afternoon meal and eventually make your way to dinner. And if you were lucky enough, you'd ended up at the tavern at the end of the night drinking a rum punch, which is a tough way to live.
Wasn't there some animosity between, I don't know if it was the Pilgrims or the Puritans, but they stayed alive. They found the Indians' cache of seed, corn seed, and appropriated that.
Which actually leads to some of the tensions that break out in the 17th century between the English and the Native Americans. How many of you have heard of King Philip's War? How many of you know anything about King Philip's War? King Philip's War was essentially a war between the descendants of the Pilgrims and the second generation of the Wampanoags that interacted with the Pilgrims. Philip, whose name was Metacom, was actually Massasoit's son, and he inherits leadership of the Wampanoag tribe. Now the problem is, by the time we get to the 1670s, the English had become much more numerous, and they had spread beyond Plymouth, and as they were spreading westward, they were encroaching on Native American land. And there was tremendous animosity between the two. The leaders in Plymouth essentially tried to force the Wampanoags to comply with English law. And the Wampanoags didn't necessarily want to. So you begin to have these animosities there. And you do have episodes where the English are appropriating the food products of the Native Americans. Another problem that occurs was that the English had cattle, and cattle need to graze, and cattle need to move. And oftentimes the English would turn their cattle out into the woods and allow them to graze free, and the cattle would inevitably wander over to the Native American cornfields and trample their corn and destroy their crops. So you do have a lot of tension that begins to emerge as the English become more numerous. Early on, the 1620s, going into the early 1630s, the Plymouth colony and the Wampanoags get along fairly well. But once that first generation of leadership, the Miles Standishes and William Bradfords, have moved on, and Massasoit has departed, and the English are growing more numerous and the Wampanoags are growing less numerous, the political tensions and social tensions between the two groups do begin to emerge. And it eventually culminates with King Philip's War in the 1670s. Any other questions? All right, well, thanks for coming out and happy Thanksgiving.